In the second part of Notes E from Chapter 3, we're going to continue to focus on the first row of the transition metals. Now we're going to look at how they form complex ions. The first thing that you should know about forming complex ions is that these elements will need to attract things that are rich in electrons. So in order to be good at pulling in electrons, these atoms have to be pretty small so that their nuclear charge, that nucleus pulling on these electrons, can really still be felt. A larger atom, like you would find towards the bottom of the periodic table, would not be as good at pulling on those other electrons. So they would be bad at attracting electrons and therefore bad at forming complex ions. But the atoms that we're looking at in the first group have this very small atomic size, and therefore their nuclear pull can really still be felt. There's very little shielding and very small distance. So we're going to be pulling in atoms that are rich in electrons and therefore forming complex ions very readily. There is actually a special term for an atom that is rich in electron, or I guess I should say a species that is rich in electrons, and that term is a ligand. So ligands are anything that is rich in electrons. So first let's look at this example of a ligand. This is ammonia, and you see the free electrons are going to make it good at being a ligand as it goes into forming a complex ion. So then the question is, what makes something a complex ion? And the answer is that a complex ion must have something called a coordinate covalent bond. A common name for a coordinate covalent bond is also called a dative bond, D-A-T-I-V-E. So in order to have a coordinate covalent bond or a dative bond, both of the shared electrons have to come from one species. So in this example, I want to take a second to tie this into a definition from Honors Chem. When we talked about acids and bases, a base would be a hydrogen or proton acceptor, and then the Lewis definition for a base was that it was an electron donor. So ammonia in this case would be the base because it is donating the electrons to the dative bond. Here we have a more formal definition for a ligand. A neutral molecule or an anion, which would be negative, right, would contain non-bonding pairs of electrons. So basically we want free electrons, lone pairs, things that are available to participate in a coordinate covalent bond. So H2O, water, would be a very common ligand. If you look at the Lewis structure of the water, you can see it has two lone pairs. Both of these lone pairs would be available to form complex ions. Now if water were to bond with another kind of compound to form a complex ion, it would be then bound to that other species. So sometimes it helps to know where the word comes from. So here you can see that the word ligand is actually coming from the Latin word for bound. Those free electrons would then bind the water to some other compound in a complex ion. There's actually a very common number of water molecules that you would find for transition metals. The most common type of transition metal complex ion is what we call hexahydrated. Hexa meaning 6. So it is very common to find exactly 6 water molecules attached to some sort of transition metal. The last thing that you should know about ligands is that there's actually a very common type of reaction where a ligand would replace another ligand, almost like an activity series with single replacement reactions. So you might have something like ammonia or cyanide, a different type of ligand, stepping in for the water and having those types of chemical reactions. Although anything that is electron rich or that has these non-bonding pairs of electrons has the potential to form complex ions, there are 7 that are very common that you should know about. Water, ammonia, chloride, cyanide, carbon monoxide, thiocyanate, and hydroxide. Most of these should be pretty familiar, except you may not have heard of thiocyanate. That's another one that'll be in one of the chapter demonstrations. So we see it has actually a lot of electrons around the sulfur and then another couple by the nitrogen. The last thing that we're going to discuss with complex ions is something called the coordination number, which is the number of lone pairs bonded to the metal ion. Typically, any ligand is only going to provide one lone pair to the metal ion, so a quick translation of coordination number is basically how many ligands is it attached to. The number of ligands attached to an atom is actually going to drive its shape. Shape is a whole big concept in chapter 4, but for right now I want to make some connections between some common shapes that go with specific coordination numbers. So for this example, if I have a coordination number of 2, that means my metal ion is only attached to 2 ligands, 1, 2. The only possible shape for 3 atoms connected to each other is linear. So if something has a coordination number of 2, the shape will always be linear. Next, let's look at a coordination number of 4. There are actually 2 potential shapes if I have a coordination number of 4. This is something called a square planar shape. In order to form this, there would have to be additional lone pairs on that metal ion, and the 4 ligands would spread out in a square, flat plane around the metal ion. The other potential shape for a coordination number of 4 is something called tetrahedral. And this is something that we looked at when we were looking at simple covalent bonds as well. Whenever I have the ligands spread out without the presence of additional lone pairs, we would form a tetrahedral shape. Next, let's look at a coordination number of 6. As we mentioned, water likes to hexahydrate or surround with 6 water molecules. Yes, this absolutely does violate the octet rule. We're actually going to discuss several exceptions to the octet rule when we get into the bonding unit in chapter 4. But for now, you should know that there is an actual shape for a coordination number of 6, where I have 6 ligands spread out around the metal ion, and that shape is called octahedral. Let's work a couple of examples where we first identify the ligand and then use that to determine the coordination number. So first, let's look at the iron attached to cyanide. Cyanide would be the ligand. It would be providing the electrons to the iron. It would be what is attaching to the iron. We can look at how many ligands we have, the 6 outside of the parentheses, in order to determine how many cyanides are attached to the iron, which would actually in turn be the coordination number. So the coordination number for this iron attached to the cyanide is 6. Now let's look at copper attached to the chlorine. In this case, chlorine would be the ligand, the electron-rich atom being attached to the transition metal of copper. In order to determine the coordination number, I want to figure out how many chlorines are attached to the copper. The 4 subscript will give me that answer. There are 4 chlorines attached to the copper, and therefore the coordination number is 4 for that compound. Notice in both of these cases, the charge outside the brackets did not apply to the problem whatsoever. In order to determine the coordination number, you basically need to determine how many ligands are attached to the transition metal, and that will be your coordination number. Now let's look at silver attached to ammonia. The NH3, the ammonia, would be our ligand, our electron-rich substance that's attached to the transition metal. Notice that the 3 on the H is part of that compound. NH3 is the ligand. So when we ask how many ammonias, I'm only looking at the 2, the subscript on the outside of the parentheses. So there would be 2 ammonias attached to silver, and therefore the coordination number is 2. Now let's look at a really tricky one. Next, I see iron is attached to cyanide and water. This one actually has 2 ligands. The cyanide would act as a ligand, and the water would act as a ligand. We can see that there are 2 cyanides and 4 waters attached to iron. To find the coordination number, we want to know how many total ligands are attached, how many lone pairs are actually being used to attach to iron. So this would include both the 2 cyanides and the 4 waters. So the total coordination number for this complex ion would be 6. At the end of these notes, you'll see a table that will give us a lot more practice with determining what part of the complex ion is the ligand, identifying the coordination number, determining the oxidation number of the central atom, and then tying the coordination number to one of the potential shapes. I'm going to work these problems out by hand, and I have here highlighted some common patterns so that it can help you kind of practice this. I would recommend trying this table out on your own and then watch the video where I work it in hand to check your work. Work it by hand to check your work. The next video to continue the notes will be notes E3, which will cover magnetic properties.